readings from Matthew 28, 16 to 17. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Amen.
It's great to see everyone. The title for my talk today is Jesus, I Have My Doubts. Have you come across this thing on the internet, ChatGPT? Yeah, you know, the online chat bot where you can kind of have a conversation with someone and it feels terrifyingly real. I had some fun with it this week when I should have been writing a talk. If you haven't heard about ChatGPT, let me tell you about it. So it's a chatbot. It's a website on the internet, and you can it pretends to it's you know a chat room. It's like it feels like a real person. You know what it is, right? I can't explain it apart from it's AI. It's artificial intelligence that regurgitates the internet, but it's terrifyingly accurate. So if you want to write an essay, it will write an essay for you, which is illegal. I think it can also probably do quite a lot of people's jobs, which is also illegal, and it can write a sermon. So if I look like I'm looking at my notes a lot tonight, it's really interesting. It's really fascinating, and what it does is it unearths a load of slightly scary questions about what's real, what's not real. And one of the things that people have to say about ChatGPT or other things is that what it does is it starts to flood the internet with a regurgitation of itself. So it's kind of churning out more and more of itself, of what the internet produces. And then you start to question like what's real and what isn't real. And so reality in itself is put into doubt. It can be a little bit scary. Things like art, beauty, they become a bit doubtful. Here's the thing though, AI, it doesn't have human faculties. Like, it can't doubt, really, and it can't create, really. It can't be original. Last Sunday, the church around the globe, and actually today in the Orthodox Church, celebrated Easter. Easter is this remarkable event where Jesus Christ, God, became man. He died and then rose to new life. He was resurrected. Death was defeated. An amazing, amazing event. It changed the course of human history. I decided to ask ChatGPT how it felt about Easter, and I got some pretty well thought through, kind of slightly scary answers. I then asked if it had any doubts following the Easter week, because I was trying to get it in a spin. And it said, as an AI language model, I do not have beliefs or doubts as humans do, since I am not capable of personal faith or emotions, which feels scary but also comforting. However, as an unbiased and objective responder, I can acknowledge that the question of whether or not Jesus rose from the dead is a matter of faith and belief, and is not something that can be definitely proven or disproven through historical or scientific inquiry alone. I got very distracted then, because I was like, there's lots of historical evidence that Jesus rose from the dead, and we got into this big, long argument, and half an hour later, I thought, I should really be writing my talk now. But the point is that ChatGPT or AI, it will never be a substitute for humanity, because it doesn't have these key human facets like faith and doubt. It just regurgitates information. You and I, we're a little bit different. So if you're here today and you've got doubts, that's a good thing. I have lots of doubts, and strangely, the week after Easter, they often seem to come to the surface. Like, Jesus, did you really die and rise to life? Honestly, I still feel like I doubt that sometimes. And that's a bit awkward because I'm a priest in the Church of England, so I shouldn't have any of these doubts. But I do. It's a bit awkward. And to be honest, it's not just the resurrection. I think the resurrection is part of it. But I have these other doubts. Like, there are a few things that I pray about quite regularly. and it feels like nothing changes. So my natural disposition is to doubt whether or not they're worth praying about, but also to doubt whether or not the whole thing is worth it anyway. And sometimes I find myself, if I was to be completely honest with you guys, I find myself at church or at home with a group of Christians in like a small group, and I think, God, I just don't really know what to do with this whole thing. And doubt, it can be crippling. And I found myself sometimes in just what feels like a gray haze. And it affects everything. I'm like, Jesus, I have my doubts. And I wonder how you're feeling after Easter. Are you ecstatic like one of the disciples that met Jesus and worshipped him? Or do you feel like as the dust settles on last week, that you're a little bit unsure? You're like, Jesus, I don't really know how to deal with this. Like, we all suffer doubts, right? They just happen. They're real. They're part of who we are. And you might be a doubting kind of person, like a cynic. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it can be a good thing. Or maybe you've just got one or two niggling doubts about something to do with Christian faith. Like, it could be the morality that's held up in it, or it could be something else. It might not even be the resurrection. It might be something really kind of menial about the faith, or something that you think is actually really important, that your friends do something different, and you think, well, maybe if I'm a Christian, that shouldn't be part of it, but that thing looks really good. Why does Christianity have to be so stuffy and boring? And maybe you've been told, just get in line, buddy, bury your doubts, get over it, get in line, this is what it means to be a Christian, forget your doubts. Maybe you've been told that, to get in line. Or maybe you just don't know where to go to ask those questions. Maybe you don't feel like you've got the space to go and ask about the doubts that you have. Maybe you feel like God will just be annoyed at you if you tell him that you're not sure about some things, if you're honest about the doubts that you might have. And maybe you find the places to ask those doubts, like on Google or a chatbot or something like that. Maybe you're at church here today with a load of Christians, and maybe you've got faith, maybe you have no faith. But maybe you're sat here and you're thinking, I don't really know how to deal with this whole thing. I don't really know what to do with what's put in front of me. Jesus, I've got my doubts. Well, today, in spite of everything, you can know that in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, there is space for your doubts. And more than that, there is space for you. In our passage today, we're in Matthew 28, which we've been going through Matthew for a few months now as a church in our Sunday series. And we're in the final few lines of the Gospel of Matthew. This is Matthew. He's bringing the story to a kind of climax. It's right at the end of it. So Jesus, last week we read about how he rose from the dead. And now he's meeting his remaining 11 disciples. And today we're focusing on just these two lines that says the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Eugene Peterson's Message translation puts it like this. Meanwhile, the 11 disciples were on their way to Galilee. They headed for the mountain that Jesus had set for their reunion. The moment they saw him, they worshipped him. Some, though, held back, not sure about worship, about risking themselves totally. Picture the scene. The 11 disciples, they're heading back up to Jerusalem, back up to Galilee from Jerusalem. It's about a 100-mile trip back up to Galilee where they first met Jesus Christ. And they're going to a place which the correct translation is actually into the hills. So they're going into the hills. I went to the Surrey Hills yesterday. They're very nice and full of people in lycra. But just imagine, no lycra, but they're going into the hills. And they've had these reports from Mary and Mary about Jesus rising from the dead. So they might be half expecting to meet Jesus. In fact, it says in the text that they're going to the place that Jesus had told them to go to. So they're probably thinking, hang on, we just saw Jesus die, but Mary have told us that he's alive, and he said to go and meet him there. So, well, let's go. What's the worst that could happen? And actually, it's far away from Jerusalem, which is where all the trouble was. So they head up into the hills. Maybe, possibly, perhaps, to meet Jesus. And there, in the hills, they meet him. The man who they'd given everything to follow, who they'd put all of their hope in, who they'd seen do remarkable, miraculous things, who they'd seen die on a cross at the hands of the Romans. He's standing there. They saw him. And we hear that some worshipped him, but others, they doubted. Other translations put it like there were some who were hesitant. They weren't sure. The Greek word for doubt here, often it means wavering or hesitancy or uncertainty, like a general lack of confidence. It's once used in the New Testament. The other time that it's used in the New Testament is when Peter sees Jesus walking on the water and runs to him. And at first he's running on the water, but then he sees the waves and hears the wind and it's raining and he thinks, and he has hesitancy. He wavers. He loses his confidence. This is the same feeling that these disciples had. So there would be some there who are probably in intellectual doubt. We're not sure. And they're thinking, hang on, we saw this guy die. This isn't right. But there'll be some there. And they're in two minds. They'll be sat there with these people who are worshiping Jesus, and they're not really sure what to do with the whole thing. They probably have no idea how to respond to Jesus. What do they do with these doubts? Like, what's going on? And there's lots of different reasons potentially for how they feel for their doubts. There'll be some who are thinking, well, the last time we saw Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the Roman soldiers arrived, and we just legged it. We just ran. We left him literally for dead. So they're probably meeting Jesus, and they're probably thinking, well, he's probably a bit annoyed at us because we ran away. And there'll be others who, like Thomas in John's Gospel, have doubts unless they see him, unless they, as it says in John, unless they put their hands in his side and see the marks in his hands, they won't believe. We don't really know what their doubts were. The text doesn't really make it clear, probably because doubt is so case-by-case specific, right? Everyone here, your doubts, you don't want someone to sit there and explain them to you, because they're all so specific, so made up of so many different things, like based on our own experience, our own hurts, our own pains, our own troubles, our own joys, our own upbringings, our backgrounds, our families. Everything gets thrown in to the mix. But what we know from the passage is that those who have doubts, it's not like they're cast out. It's not like they sit there and they're excluded by Jesus. He doesn't go to the people who are worshiping, well, you're in, and the people who are doubting, you're out. The people who doubt are included as much as everyone else. Because doubt, in many ways, is just part of the human existence. It's part of who we are. It doesn't deter Jesus. It turns out God's pretty tolerant of doubt. Philip Yancey talks about doubt, and he says, I challenge people to find a single argument against God in the older agnostics, Bertrand Russell, Voltaire, David Hume, or the newer ones, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, that's not already included in books like Psalms, Job, Habakkuk, Lamentations. I have respect for a God who not only gives us the freedom to reject him, but also includes the arguments we can use in the Bible. God is very tolerant of doubt, and it's throughout the scriptures. He's all right with it. He's pretty chilled about it. And for Jesus, this doubt in the disciples' life is not the end of the story. And it's really interesting what Jesus does with their doubts. He doesn't give them a regurgitated statement like, come on boys, get in line, read this, read that. He sits down with them and opens the scriptures later, but at this point, he doesn't do that. He does something very different. In the Message translation, in verse 18, if you've got your Bible open, it says this: Jesus, undeterred, unfazed by the doubts, not bothered, went right ahead and gave this charge. The Greek word there for undeterred means came forward, comes towards, comes near. Jesus doesn't stop his disciples in their doubt, in their confusion or their two minds. He doesn't say, well, you better just get your head in the game. I heard a story of a vicar who was, he just started his first vicar job. He had to work for someone else for that time. And he was questioning whether or not he was in the right job. He was questioning whether or not he made the right decision, giving up his career, training at college, and then going and working for a church full time. And his boss just said to him, well, buddy, better make your mind up because people are dying in their sins, and then left. That's not what Jesus does. That is bad advice. Jesus does something very different. Jesus includes the people with doubt. He does more than just includes them. He includes them in the story going forward that's going to continue after he's gone back up to heaven. He includes them in a mission. He includes them in a charge. He gives them a charge. There's a place for the disciples' doubt, but Jesus comes to them and he gives them certainty that he knows the path forward. And there's echoes here in this passage of Matthew 4, when Jesus first meets the disciples by the shore, by the Sea of Galilee, which was up in the hills. It's a similar place. He meets Peter, Andrew, James, and John by a lake up in the hills. And in spite of everything that's going on in their life, he says, come and follow me. It's very similar what's going on here. It's always been the call of Jesus, therefore, to follow him into the hills, into the wild. And whether or not you're the sold-out kind of guy or girl, the keen bean Christian, or whether or not you're someone who sits there and thinks, I don't know what to make of all this, Jesus includes you in his ongoing story. Doubts or no doubts, but especially if you've got doubts, you're included. This is a picture of my friend Aaron. Aaron, we'll keep him up for a little while. He grew up in Malaysia. His grandparents moved to Malaysia from Sri Lanka, and he grew up always thinking that he would join the army. So he was in army school, because that's a thing, and then he would go to army camps in the summer. He was in like that, I don't know what the forces club, the one, I was in something called Air Cadets. I guess it's cadets. Yes, cadets. There you go. So he was in that growing up for his whole time. He went off to technical college for university. He was doing the same thing. It was a military college. And towards the end of his time at university, he felt as if God was potentially asking him to do something a little bit different. Maybe even to go into ministry full-time, but he was not sure at all. So he had a job working for a charity and an organization, and I interviewed Aaron. We could take him down. He's good enough, Aaron. He looks good though, doesn't he? Oh, he's gone. He's on that screen. Sorry, none of you can see him. Never mind. Anyway, I interviewed Aaron for ordination in the Diocese of West Malaysia. We'd set up a theological college to train people to be priests, church planters, church leaders in the Anglican Church in Malaysia. And I interviewed Aaron. And have you heard of a car crash as a term for an interview? You know that. It was that. So he came, and do you know if you go to a job interview, you put a game face on, you're kind of like, I'm going to boss this. I'm going to bring something to the party. I'm prepped. I'm sure. I'm ready to go. Aaron wasn't prepped. He wasn't sure. He didn't put his game face on. But at the end of the interview, we all felt like maybe God was actually in this. And so he started that summer to train for ordination in the Anglican Church in Malaysia. And 3 years later, he was ordained. He was still working for this charity as well while he was doing it. But last week, his church started for the first week. So he planted a church, and he planted it in a city on the other side of Malaysia. In spite of his doubts and his hesitancy and his really not sure, God took him on a journey. He took him on a journey across the ocean, literally, to a different part of the country he was from. Took him on an amazing adventure, and he's going to continue leading him. And because of Aaron's, he just went along with what he felt like God was asking, in spite of his doubts. That city that he's planting a church into, people there have got a chance of meeting Jesus and going on a similar journey as well. Maybe you're not called today to plant a church. Maybe you are. Maybe you are. Maybe God is calling you to start a church. But maybe it's something a bit more specific, case by case, for you. Maybe it's a new project at work, and you're thinking, oh, maybe God's asking me to get involved in this. Or it could be a new job, and you're thinking, maybe God's asking me to get involved in this. Or maybe it's like a new relationship. Maybe you're thinking, maybe God's asking me to do something about this, but you've got your doubts about it. And maybe it's faith in general, and you're thinking, I'm not really sure what to do with this. But maybe God's saying, it doesn't really matter. You don't need to have it all together. What does Jesus do to the disciples? He commissions them all. He gives them all a charge, a task. Those who worship and those who doubt. So if you've got some doubts, cool, you're in. It doesn't matter. Because what happens in the Christian life is that these things that we would call negatives, like doubt or death, they get flipped around, turned on their head. Matthew's gospel is great at turning things on its head. They get turned into positives. So death in the Christian life, Jesus dying on a cross at the hands of the Romans, dying for the sins of the whole world, for you and for me here today, is flipped on its head and becomes life for you and me here today. And doubt in the Christian faith can be flipped on its head, and it leads to curiosity, which eventually leads to certainty. But God starts with our doubts. He doesn't start over here. He starts where you are today, because they're real. They're part of who you are. They're not to be brushed over. They're not to be put to one side. You don't need to be sat down and just regurgitated information at. God doesn't meet his people like that. He meets them exactly where they are. He meets you and me here today exactly where you are. Doubts or no doubts. But for most of us here, lots of doubts. Maybe God today is asking you, do you want to come with me into this new world? Because he approaches you no matter what. In the midst of doubts, midst of confusion, he comes to you. He comes to you. Because in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, there is so much space, not just for those who worship, but for those who doubt. And maybe if you are one who's doubted and you've put yourself out in the cold for whatever reason, maybe you just need to know today that God includes you. He's big enough for your doubts. There's space for you. And actually, he's not saying to you, right, get all your theological ducks in a row, get everything pulled together. He's not saying that. He's saying, come with me, follow me. And the best thing, if you go with Jesus, regardless of your doubts, you might go to somewhere you never knew you might go. Think about the disciples and where they ended up. all around the world. Thomas, who Jesus met, who had lots of doubts, it said that he ended up in India, which is thousands and thousands of miles away from where he first met Jesus. Now, you might not end up thousands and thousands of nautical miles away, but you might end up thousands and thousands of, conceptual miles. Your life might look so different if you decide to follow Jesus. Today, the risen Christ, he walks into this room right now, and he walks right up to you, and he is alive, and he stands in front of you, and he says, do you want to follow me? And so for us as a church, can you imagine what it might be all like if we lived a bit like that, if like we knew that, in spite of our doubts, in spite of everything that's going on, that feels wrong, that feels like we're not sure. Can you imagine what it might be like if we grappled with this? The difference we might make. People are drawn in by honesty, and potentially for too long, the church has shut down arguments, and people have shut it out, therefore. What if people saw that we were trying to grapple with our doubts as well? I think they might like that God that we offer the world. And maybe you're here today and you've got no faith whatsoever, or you're doubting faith. Well, Jesus Christ, he walks into this room and he approaches us as a church and he says, will you come? Will you follow me? Doubts, no doubts. Shall we pray?